but I will use the microphone just to account for good sound and because we're recording the talk. So welcome everyone. Hi. So happy you're here. Thanks for being at the Eastside Freedom Library. We're really happy to welcome you. My name is Camila Leiva. I'm the project and operations manager here at the library. And at every event, I always like to ask, just by a show of hands, who has been here before? Okay, so our facilities manager raised his hand, yes. I'm glad you've been here before. Okay, so a good amount of you. Okay, good. But a few new people, so welcome to those for whom this is your first time here. I think you chose a fantastic event to be your first time. We are really excited to have Omar here. And I am going to introduce Layla, who will be our facilitator. But before we do that, I know we're a small group, but just wanted to let you all know that our bathrooms are downstairs, so you find them going down the stairs right there. But if you prefer, we have an elevator back there. The stairs are the bathroom's a little weird because you have to use the key to open the door, take the key with you, go inside, lock the little latch, and then when you come out, put the key back in the lock. We invite you also after the talk to go and check out the Visualizing Palestine exhibit in our community room downstairs. If we don't have time today, we have our open hours, and we're going to have a few extra hours in the next few weeks that the exhibit will be up, and we'll be posting those tomorrow on our socials and website. So without further ado, I've been getting to work and to meet both Kiri and Layla through this project of collaborating and organizing this event. And so I've gotten to know that Layla uses they, them, and is a scholar of Arab feminisms, holds a PhD from the University of Southern California, and currently teaches at Macalester College. They are also a grassroots organizer for Palestinian Liberation. And I forgot to say that ESFL is staunchly a pro-Palestinian organization, so hosting this event here made a lot of sense, and getting to meet Layla through this process has been an honor. So without further ado,
I will take the mic now. Thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate you guys being here. It's nice to have a group. This is part of our Kiri and I's visualizing occupation, community media, and embodied resistance to settler colonial violence, which is, as we conceptualized it, an invitation to make active connections between our current political moment here in the Twin Cities and other occupations around the world. Tonight's event is part of a larger series of programming through Macalester in partnership with the Eastside Freedom Library and MISNA and other organizations to gather and learn and reflect dialogue on visual regimes of power, militarism, but especially making connections to Palestine and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. We have many sponsors for this event, so I would like to thank them. The Racial Justice Project Fund, the Macalester Native and Indigenous Initiative, the Mississippi River Open School for Kinship and Social Exchange, the Kofi Annan Institute for Global Citizenship, the WGSS Department, the Media and Cultural Studies, Environmental Studies Departments, Macro Palestine, Pacific Student Alliance, Theater and Dance, the Department of Theater and Dance, and then Educators for Justice in Palestine, Macalester Library, and the Eastside Freedom Library. And with that, it really takes a community to put, yes, okay, so I will now introduce Omar. Dr. Omar Zahzah is a writer, a journalist, and a poet, as well as an assistant professor of Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diasporas, Ahmed Studies, and the Department of Race and Resistance Studies at San Francisco State University. Terms of Servitude is Omar's first book, which documents how digital platforms and technology companies based in the United States support the Israeli settler colonial project through censorship. Terms of Servitude demonstrates how social media has become a new tool of anti-Palestinian suppression, even though these platforms were initially instrumental in advancing the Palestinian struggle. And Omar's going to do maybe like about 45 minutes-ish, and then we'll do a facilitated Q&A, and then we will wrap up and people can head downstairs.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, wow. Okay, so thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library. Thank you to the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department, to the Racial Justice Project Fund, yes, and all of the co-sponsors and all of you for being here. It's really a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. So what I found tends to work best at these things in terms of a format is to talk about the book by way of kind of giving the narrative of the background of what led me to start working on this project, the specific points that it evolved out of, and then through that to get to the particular conceptual interventions that I'm trying to make in terms of the arguments I'm making about big tech and about social media in relationship to the Palestinian struggle, the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. And so I want to take us back a few years, and it seems, I think, a little bit more, each day it becomes a little bit more difficult to do because things, seem like the exceptions are only increasing and augmenting. But this all for me began really in 2021 and 2021 getting into 2022, which I'll talk about in just a second. But I think some of you here may recall that 2021 was when we started hearing about a occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood known as Sheikh Jarrah. The people in the crowd kind of remember those terms. Yeah, I'm seeing a little bit. So just as by way of a quick recap, Sheikh Jarrah is the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood where Palestinian families were facing expulsion from their homes, essentially. Right now, the narrative was that this was officially framed as an eviction order, but I think it's, I don't really need to remind people in the audience here that you can't refer to it as an eviction order because there's no legitimacy to the military occupation, that the Zionist state practices. So they have no authority or standing to expel people from their homes. But, the narrative about this is that it began as an eviction order. These families were told that they were going to be dispossessed by the Israeli state. And so, they started pushing back in various ways, engaging in various forms of activism and organizing. And, the families and the broader community, Palestinians of all backgrounds, basically, who were immediately impacted, started engaging in different forms of advocacy and organizing and resistance. Now, before I come back to the actual book project, I always think it's important to reflect upon how what was unique about Sheikh Jarrah is not what the families were facing, because as something else I think a lot of us in the crowd are familiar with is that it's very common for Palestinians to be expelled from their homes because of the Israeli settler colonial project. We're seeing it's very common because of Zionism as a broader regional imperial project for, people in surrounding areas to be dispossessed from their homes, as we're seeing in Lebanon right now, right? So that wasn't unique, but what was unique was that the pushback that these Palestinians engaged in started to gain increasing traction, right? You started to see not just local, but even international coverage. And you started to see how the organizing, the activism they were engaging in, and particularly the messaging that they were using, was having some kind of a broader cultural impact, right? And it's always kind of interesting how when you're dealing with various systems of oppression and subjugation, oftentimes there will be one occurrence that is very common to that system of subjugation. But for some reason, there's a series of circumstances that are in place that contribute to that incident becoming kind of a flashpoint that becomes sort of an entry point for broader cultural consciousness, right? So Sheikh Jarrah for the Palestinian struggle, I think, was definitely one of those moments. And so you have their organizing and their advocacy, and you also have the reliance on various forms of media, in particular digital media, right? And so, these Palestinians take to digital platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, now X, right? And they start posting about what's happening to them, what they're facing. And they start, through that, their cause spreads. There's an increasing platforming of this issue. And there's also, interestingly, an increasing platforming by way of the very kind of cultural apparatuses that had for decades been sort of the arch silencers of Palestine, if you will, of Palestinians, I should say. In 1984, the Palestinian academic and activist Edward Said wrote an essay called Permission to Narrate, where he described how, Western media writes a lot about Palestine, but doesn't really give any space to Palestinians, right? Palestinians as subjects are denied what he refers to as permission to narrate. And obviously, it's the exact opposite when it comes to Israelis, right, who are often platformed and are humanized and allowed to talk about their fears and their struggles and all of these things, right? Whereas Palestinians are completely absent. So, for decades, the legacy media, and by that I mean things like, newspapers, journals, news broadcasts, right, had been one of the chief culprits in terms of erasing Palestinians, right? And, this is often why activists for Palestine and, scholars who write about Palestine really have to keep coming back to media, because media is often framed, I think rightfully, as an arena of struggle, and even oftentimes as very much a complicit accomplice, in Israel's project, because the media works to manufacture consent for the Israeli project in the same way that it works to manufacture consent for various other aspects of imperialism, right? So all this is to say, coming back to 2021, when you start to see this activism and organizing and, these posts gaining increasing prominence, then you start to see, this space that had been, one of the default invisibilizers, if you will, of Palestinians suddenly start to reverse course. And you start to see these Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah be platformed on places like CNN, right? So you have those of you who remembered, the Sheikh Jarrah episode may recall the famous clip where Muhammad al-Kurd, the, Palestinian poet and journalist who was, among the families basically facing dispossession, is interviewed by CNN, right? And is asked by the reporter, she says, do you support the violent protests that have erupted, in support of you and your family, right? And so this is a very typical media trope, oftentimes legacy media or really corporate media, right, will try to inherently frame Palestinian resistance as, violent, as threatening. And then rather than being able to talk about the actual oppression they're facing, then Palestinians or sometimes their supporters have to instead engage with unpacking, these dehumanizing framings, to which they're subjected. And so, instead of kind of playing this game, what Muhammad al-Kurd does in this interview is he says, well, do you support the violent dispossession of me and my family, right? And it's kind of instantaneous. And it causes a pause. There's a bit of an awkwardness, and I think that's part of what led to the clip, gaining the virality that it did. So there's moments like this, right, where you start to see this increasing platforming, and it's not just Palestinians talking about the immediate oppression that they're facing, but it's also very intentional interventions in broader cultural framings of the Palestinian struggle. So, there's starts to be increasingly platform messaging about rethinking how the issue of Palestine is framed and pushing back against the dominant kind of liberal propagandistic framework of things like, a centuries-old struggle, or about, these two equally empowered sides that are simply fighting one another out of hatred, to instead the actual root cause, which is an issue of colonialism, right? A struggle against settler colonialism. And so, seeing the impact, I guess, of these demonstrations, seeing how the messages of these Palestinians were spreading, and it was actually having a discernible cultural impact, right? And I think it's also important to note that I think it's very important sequentially, and I think especially being where we are, it's even more important to emphasize, right, that 2021 is following very much on the heels of the 2020 George Floyd uprisings, right? Where similarly you have, the activism and uprisings and the reliance on alternative forms of media that then leads to an actual broader cultural reckoning with systemic oppression, right? So in this case, right, you have a broader reckoning that really reframes understandings of racism from being something about individual prejudice, right, sort of individual attitudes, to kind of recentering the broader systemic nature of anti-Black racism as such, right? And so I think that that's also important to note, because I think that this sort of helped pave the way for the type of reception that, the Sheikh Jarrah uprisings would then receive, right? But in any case, we're seeing, these narrative shifts that are happening as a result of organizing and activism, and seeing the kind of very intentional savvy with which Palestinians are using various forms of media, newer forms of digital media, and intentionally playing them off against legacy media. This is also around the time where you start to see things like Palestinians posting on Instagram and starting to kind of edit, New York Times headlines. It's become a very standard, I think, trope of media critique now, but it's really in this moment that those things really start to be more and more streamlined. And it's also where you have things like, there's this clip of the settler who's one of the settlers basically occupying the El Kurd family home, and when Muhammad El Kurd's sister comes out and she sees this settler, named Yaqub, and she says, "You're stealing my house," and he goes, "Well, if I don't steal it, somebody else is going to steal it, so why are you yelling at me?" Right? That goes viral. So all of these things are spreading, and it's clear that digital media is playing an important role, right? It's acting as an important tool, let's say, right, in helping to advance these messages and bring about these kind of narrative interventions, right? Whereas before you'd had this silencing and this erasure that was practiced, as a matter of, business as usual by legacy media. You start to then have, organizers and activists using digital media, to create new kind of narrative openings and interventions to the point that it does start to have a broader impact on media as such, right? And then just as we're starting to see these shifts, right, just as these, increasing of Palestinian perspectives becomes so prominent, you then start to see the very platforms that had helped make this possible kind of try to reverse course, right? So then, these the companies behind these platforms, like Facebook, like Instagram, right, start to engage in massive censorship. And so then you start to see mass censorship of posts about Sheikh Jarrah, of posts about the incursions into the Al-Aqsa Mosque by the Israeli occupation forces, censorship about the then most recent bombing campaigns of Gaza. And, it's to the point, and it's at such a scale that legacy media then has to report on that, right? So it starts to be, why are these companies censoring all these posts by Palestinians, about Sheikh Jarrah, about the Al-Aqsa Mosque, about the Gaza Strip? And, so the companies do provide an explanation, and they say, well, we're experiencing a glitch, right? This is, of course, not intentional censorship in any way. This is just an issue that we're having, and we're going to work out the system because we value every single individual voice, and we believe in freedom of speech, and we're the town square, all of these things, right? So, so what is clearly a form of targeted censorship, that is impacting Palestinians, just as, their utilization of these platforms had such a palpable impact, right, is written off basically as, a technical malfunction, right? And I think, again, every time I tell this story, I'm always very conscious of the moment in which I'm telling it, because I think maybe many of us are a little bit more cynical now about these things, and this sounds, so familiar that it almost seems like it's not worth commenting upon. And I think that feeling and that impulse is part of the reason why I wanted to spend so much time thinking about social media as both a tool and as an instrument of oppression in relationship to Palestine, because it is something that we really take for granted, and yet it is something that we in many ways have so little control over, right? So I think it's important to try to come back to this moment where we started to see these kind of novel developments, that were made possible by Palestinian resistance and organizing, and then seeing what happens, when the gains of organizing become so manifest, right? Is that these companies then try to reverse course. So that kind of paradox, right, was very pronounced, and it was something that really stood out to me. Now, there was something else that happened that I also want to talk about. So we'll bracket 2021 going into 2022 for a second. And I want to then take us back to 2020. You will recall that this was the time of the COVID-19 lockdown. So many of us all of us, I guess, were on Zoom, right? So we're attending classes via Zoom. We're relying on this video conferencing platform that really exercises the monopoly over educational content and programming, and is the thing that all educators really need to use in order to have their classes. So in 2020, there's an advertisement for an open classroom that is going to be taught by Rabab Abdulhadi, who is a Palestinian feminist professor, director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at San Francisco State, which is also the program that I teach for. And Dr. Abdulhadi is going to co-teach this class with Tomomi Kinokawa in Women and Gender Studies. And the class is going to feature the Palestinian liberation icon Layla Khalid in conversation with other icons from liberation struggles, including Ronnie Casserole. So it's basically going to be a roundtable around gender, justice, and liberation, right? Now, what happens once these advertisements about the class start to go out is there is, well, no longer, but there was at the time this app called ActIL, and this was an app that basically is Israeli aligned, and the way it works is it basically presents various tasks that it wants its users to engage in as quests. So it kind of gamifies different tasks related to basically, getting speakers, shut down speakers who are trying to talk about Palestine, or, getting events, basically raising a lot of outrage about events related to Palestine. And so once this classroom is advertised, ActIL, sends its users on a quest to really complain to Zoom about the fact that this class is happening. So you have these users that start to reach out to Zoom's office. They go and these Zionists go and they, engage in demonstrations outside of Zoom headquarters. And Zoom actually capitulates and says, we are not going to allow this classroom to appear on our platform. So it's not the first time that a meeting has been canceled by Zoom, but as far as I can tell, and I'd love to hear if people have different information, but as far as I can tell, this is the first and I think the only time that a classroom has been directly, intentionally canceled by Zoom, because people were complaining about the content of that class. So Zoom says we're not going to allow this to happen, right? Then, in collaboration with faculty from, the University of California, I think it's Merced, they tried to do a repeat of this class that is actually also going to be a conversation about free speech, right? And again, Zoom says we're not going to allow this to take place. So, they cancel the class about gender, justice, and liberation, and then they're canceling the class about free speech, right? That is trying to talk about what happened before. So, I'm seeing all of these things, right? I'm seeing the Zoom cancellations, right, as a result of, Zionist pressure. And then I'm seeing what is happening with social media in terms of the targeted censorship of Palestinians who are posting about Sheikh Jarrah, right? And, again, I'm kind of struck by this contradiction that on the one hand, you have this technology that has the capacity to really enable forms of expression that would otherwise be completely erased, from the cultural sphere. And it has the capacity to really enable direct connections between people that, for decades had been impossible. And yet, when you have, people engaged in the freedom struggle trying to actually, capitalize upon this capacity, right, the companies are blocking them from doing that, right? And so, kind of being struck by this, I write an article for Al Jazeera, and I call it Digital Apartheid, right? Palestinians being silenced on social media. And I talk about Zoom, and then I talk about what's happening with Sheikh Jarrah and how these companies are engaging in this increasing pattern of silencing Palestinians who are engaging, in various forms of advocacy and expression about the Palestinian struggle, at times engaging in direct narrative intervention about the framing of that struggle. And, I was thinking of apartheid because I was really focused on the idea of separation or distinction, right? And I read this piece and then I sort of assumed that that's going to be it. So just, as part of the broader background at the time, I was working at a nonprofit called Eyewitness Palestine. And so my job was really to train delegates who were going to go to Palestine about Palestinian political history and racial justice. And so, I'd finished grad school, but I was not in academia. And I was also, doing as much as I could in terms of being a contributing journalist to outlets like the Electronic Intifada and Mondoweiss, right? And so but when I write that Al Jazeera piece, I pretty much assume that that's going to be it, because even though, there is very clear censorship that is escalating, given the kind of the broader tenor of the Sheikh Jarrah moment, that, if you'll recall, also became the Unity Intifada in 2022, where Palestinians from all over the world were saying, we are all one people bound up in one struggle, which I think is very significant, because this is essentially a reaffirmation of the ethos of the Palestinian liberation, the birth of the modern Palestinian liberation struggle as such in the 60s, right? Where, again, that was the principle, that all Palestinians, wherever they are, have a stake and a duty to fight for a future liberated Palestine, total liberation of land and people. So now we're having a reaffirmation of this, and Palestinians are saying we reject this idea that we're separate from one another, we're all interconnected to one another. So seeing all of these things happen at the same time that you're having this broader cultural shift in terms of how Palestine is framed, it just made it seem as though there was some kind of a change that was, inevitable. So it seemed to me that the censorship was a censorship born of desperation, and it was only going to be temporary, right? Now, we know that's not what happened, right? But, I basically in 2022 start to develop the seeds of what will become this book, Terms of Servitude, right? And part of the reason for that is that I also continue to be asked to write pieces about people who are facing various forms of digital suppression, right? From, the censorship of their activity on social media to digital doxing and online harassment by places like Canary Mission, and now there's StopAntisemitism.org, and even newer places like we've seen, crop up around Colombia. And so it becomes just sort of evident to me that, this is not going to go away anytime soon. And I also started thinking about how we've had so many wonderful interventions in terms of thinking about big tech, and how, big tech, these American companies, for all of their branding and propaganda about, making the world a better place, and, promoting, greater, societal equality, right, actually is an industry very much reliant upon and deeply entrenching systems of oppression. So, things like anti-Black racism or misogyny or patriarchy. So I was thinking of, books like Race After Technology by Ruah Benjamin, or, Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Noble, right? And then kind of trying to square that with what I was seeing in terms of what Palestinians were experiencing, where you have just a very naked case of an entire group of people being, targeted for censorship and for suppression by some of the most prominent tech companies. And this is not passing by without any kind of comment, but certainly not something that reflects the degree of the situation, which is that this is essentially a completely normalized differential treatment of an entire group of people, based on their identity and based on the fact that they're fighting a liberation struggle. And so it occurred to me that, it might be important to think about sort of a Palestinian response to, this broader tendency in tech criticism, which is trying to think about how is big tech actually fortifying these very systems that it claims to be the antidote to, right? So I develop a proposal for this book, send it, and, the Censored Press, in partnership with Seven Stories Press, accepts it, and I start working on it. Then you have, October 7th, 2023, and then we have the latest accelerated genocide, right? And there's a period where I'm sort of unable to continue working because of the genocide, and because also especially in the very beginning of the genocide. I think for me personally, there was this sense that it's important to kind of remain rooted to more collectivist undertakings. So going to demonstrations, doing mutual aid, donating to fundraisers, but really not focusing on things that are geared toward the individual, right? So it becomes sort of difficult for me to keep writing at this point. But eventually what happens is that I start to realize that as it's clear that there's not going to be kind of a broader international sort of intervention at the scale, obviously, that we're going to need to stop something like this, that in fact the genocide is being fully enabled, right, and eventually expands into broader regional atrocities, right, that part of, taking action needs to be people doing whatever they can with wherever they are. And so for me, I realized that, even as I was doing these other things, I also had this project that could be another way of sort of making an intervention, right? And so that kind of is what inspired me to continue working on it, especially seeing that the forms of censorship and suppression that really began to be rolled out in 2021 at that scale were being streamlined and normalized all throughout this latest genocide. And the stakes of that, were becoming even more stark, because in this case, the use of digital media is, to document individual instances of atrocity, but they're also supposed to be part of a broader archive that is created for a moment when there is eventually going to be a reckoning with the genocide. So this is also supposed to be an archive of genocide. So the stakes of this completely normalized suppression and censorship are even higher at this moment. So all of that kind of gets me to continue working on the text, right? And I can go pivot here and I'll say a little bit about some of the conceptual interventions that I was trying to do. So first and foremost, what I do in the book is I repurpose this term digital settler colonialism. Other writers have used it. I'm using it, though, in a particular way, which is twofold. First, to think about how are online digital spaces weaponized in such a way to act as extensions of physical processes of settler colonialism, military occupation, and apartheid, right? But secondly, I really wanted to emphasize how this process is made possible by the willing collusion and collaboration of U.S. big tech companies, right? So the companies, like, for example, companies that are willingly engaging in these anti-Palestinian forms of censorship, that is often done at the behest of the Israeli government, right? They're choosing to do those things, right? Companies don't need to accede to an increasing Israeli presence, among their staff or on their boards, but this is a choice that they make because they're actively invested in the Zionist project, right? And I think that that's also part of reckoning with the fact that, not just tech, not just digital media, but, the media industry as such, all of it really is predicated upon supporting the geo-imperial status quo. So normalizing imperialism as much as possible, because profit, under this hyper-capitalist imperialist social order really is based upon supporting the interests of the U.S. imperialist power, and the U.S. supports Israel because it's to its benefit to do so, right? Now, of course, I know that there's a lot of different conversations about that now with all of these political schisms, but ultimately, as a project, U.S. imperialism is interested in its own domination and in supporting the actors that will enable its broader global hegemony, right? And so that's also why, to a certain extent, I'm writing about Palestine, but we don't want to exceptionalize Palestine to the extent that it seems that in other cases, there's going to be choices that are made at the geo-imperial level that are really about justice or equality, because that's not the case, right? But so digital settler colonialism was the term, that I had repurposed to kind of try to describe what I was seeing, also as a way of kind of helping reaffirm the scale of the issue, right? So it's tempting to sort of individualize these experiences of censorship or suppression and say, like, well, this is just one individual or this is just one individual's post. But in reality, the idea is to mass target this issue so that it is something that can no longer be expressed on the platforms where the greatest number of people, still happen to be, right? And so in that sense, it's a digital reflection of the physical process of dispossession and expulsion. And so I wanted to do that because I feel like it's important to understand how at the root, this process is inherently colonial. And of course, I also talk about, the ways that AI technology facilitates military targeting and violence, right? Because you cannot not talk about that when you're engaging in this topic, right? Because that's such an important part of also understanding, how big tech fortifies the oppression of Palestinians. But I did want to make sure that I also focused on social media and framed the fact that it is so pivotal, and it's also something that has important implications for fighting colonialism and for understanding how this is part and parcel of a broader colonial process. But, I also think it's important not to, as much oppression as there is and as many degrees and scales to oppression as there is, I really think it's important not to only emphasize oppression. And so I really wanted to be careful in the book to also think about different aspects of resistance, right? So I have an entire third and final section of the book that is really focused on different ways that people resist what I'm defining as digital settler colonialism. I look at different forms and practices of resistance, from militant resistance to activists and organizers, who continue to push back against, the anti-Palestinian policies of big tech companies. And I also look at, labor, right? So I look at things like the No Tech for Apartheid and how tech workers are actually fighting, things like the Project Nimbus contract between Google and Amazon to help the Israeli military really streamline its genocide, and doing that from inside the belly of the beast, right? So the importance of labor power in this as well. And finally, though, even though I'm talking a lot about all of these innovations in tech and things that are very particular to the current moment, working on this also kind of showed me that in many ways I'm actually talking about things that have been true for decades. And what I mean by that is that, Palestinians, in fact, as revolutionaries, as activists, part of that their work has always had to be navigating hostile media landscapes that were predicated upon their erasure. And so Palestinians had to become very adept at becoming savvy practitioners of a media space that was never meant for them in the first place, and to really orient their navigation of those spaces accordingly. And so I have a chapter in the book where I kind of actually open with reflecting on the famous interview between the Palestinian revolutionary Ghassan Kanafani and the journalist Richard Carleton, right? A lot of people may remember the quotes from that where he says, Carleton asks him, why won't you engage in peace talks with the Israelis? And he goes, you don't exactly mean peace. You mean capitulation. You mean surrendering. And he says, well, why don't you have a conversation? He says, well, that's a kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, right? So it's all of these interventions that are really kind of flipping the script on the kind of more propagandistic, hegemonic framing of Palestine that we tend to see. And I think it's testament to the fact that Palestinians have had to become very savvy users of media in a way to get across a message that was never supposed to be broadcast. And so to that end, I was really realizing how what we're seeing in terms of what Palestinians do with social media is something that's been in place for decades, right? And it's why media work has always been such an important arm of Palestinian resistance all the way through. So this isn't something that is just specific to this current moment. It's been an ongoing tradition of Palestinian resistance. And I also think about a concept that I refer to in the book as virtual Palestine. And the simplest way to explain that is when we think about the suppression or deletion of posts, you have the one post, right? Or you have the one account. But that's not just what these forms of erasure are intended to undo. It's also supposed to be an attack upon the broader kind of symbolic idea of a liberated homeland, right? And a shared culture and history and politic, right? The thing that really inspires people to keep resisting. That's also what these forms of erasure are intended to destroy, right? And so I call that, that sort of animating nucleus that brings all Palestinians and their allies together. That's what I refer to as virtual Palestine. It's the thing that continues to be elaborated when people continue to speak out, continue to resist, and continue to post, and talk about, the ongoing struggle against colonialism in spite of all of these odds. And so that's another way that I thought it was important to think about how we're also having many examples of resistance and to give frameworks for that resistance. And I think I want to emphasize here too that a lot of that, the background for that was really drawn from the late Palestinian poet, an educator out of Tahrir, who was assassinated by Israel in December 2023. Reading a lot of his work about the importance of narrative and, interviewing Palestinians, who had been contemporaries of Tahrir and worked with him and been mentored by him, because one of the things he always emphasized was the importance and the power of story. And this was a concept that really guided the way that Palestinians in Gaza that I spoke to, had used social media and really used it in such a particular way as to break through the narrative embargoes that they experienced, not just from Western legacy media, but even initially from local Arab media, right? They'd said that there were things that no channel was covering. And so we had to learn how to be able to speak about it in such a way that spread fast, right? And of course, the power of narrative and the power of story was crucial to the way that they started to talk about their struggle and present their struggle to others, and so I thought it was important to document, those stories as well, to really think about how are people resisting at various levels, in spite of these seemingly insurmountable odds. So those are some of the main kind of theoretical interventions I tried to do with the text. And of course, it's a mix of, journalism, scholarly research, and of course, a lot of interviews. And I think the interviews are the most important part because I always try to make sure, especially in these contexts where people are having their voices and their perspectives, intentionally erased, you want to make sure to give people, as much of a space to speak back as possible. So I really wanted to get that through as well. I think I'll go ahead and end there, and I'm happy to answer any questions or comments. So thank you.
Thank you. Do folks have questions? Because I have questions, but if you guys have questions, we have a mic to be passed around.
Hello, hello. Oh, there we go.
I can start then.
Go for it.
Okay, cool. Well, first off, thank you. I think hearing about the process of writing is oftentimes as important as the writing itself. And so hearing your arrival at this project makes it make sense. Not that it doesn't make sense without it. But I have a general question about your transition from, or your development of your idea about digital apartheid to digital settler colonialism, and thinking through the relationship between the digital world and the material world, the data body and the physical body, having this kind of mirrored development of a political framework for understanding what's happening from apartheid to settler colonialism in the digital sphere, if that was something that came organically, or where you looked to develop that further.
Yeah, thank you. So the transition really happened. I think it basically coincided with when I started to realize that what I had in front of me was a longer project and not simply this article, because when I started to think about all of the layers that were there, kind of at a more mechanical level, I think it also became a little bit more epistemological. And then with that, I also realized that, in this piece, initially I had just focused on apartheid, and I realized that apartheid was insufficient, not because Palestinians don't experience apartheid, but because apartheid is actually just one aspect of the broader project, which is a settler colonial project. So apartheid is a technology of settler colonialism, like military occupation is, and and so that's when I realized that the framing really needs to think about the digital in terms of how it's facilitating colonialism, which encompasses apartheid, but is not necessarily just reducible to it. But of course, when we're thinking about the shift to the digital, then you're also thinking about what do bodies become, going from physical to digital, which is like the data, right? And so it's interesting. I was just talking about this with a student yesterday who asked the question of, there's kind of a paradox because these technologies, on the one hand, people want the the indigenous presence to completely disappear, but on the other hand, they really want it because they want to be tracking it and they want to be monitoring it. So there's this like kind of vicious paradox that is alive in the way that tech really is working to fortify this colonial project, which is that when we're thinking about digital expression, a lot of it is focused on censorship, but there's also this other aspect of really tracking the movements and enabling surveillance. And surveillance is a way of ultimately fortifying these products all the more, right? So that was definitely something that was very pronounced, not just in working through the book, but I think also in some projects that came about after the book, even in continuing to look at the complicity of different companies like Dell and realizing how oftentimes companies don't just support the colonial project in one form. Often there'll be multiple ways in which they're interconnected, right? And so a lot of that does come down to physical processes of surveillance and the mining of data, to better refine these products, right?
You actually started to talk about something that I was going to ask about, which is about the rest of Silicon Valley that's not social media, and that is surveillance primarily, but also big data and the monetization of data for the project of surveillance, and then all of the parts of Silicon Valley that are actually even more nefarious than that. And I'm wondering, how did you come to chunk off this piece of it? And then what are the to what extent are some of the analysis applicable to the other parts of Silicon Valley, or how should we think about their interrelationship?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think as I was saying earlier, I placed a lot of emphasis on the social media because I think that there's so many other aspects of tech repression that I wanted to make sure that I also gave that a particular place and talked about how it's a little bit more significant than I think we may often be inclined to give it credit for. But that said, of course, I ended up, out of necessity, because you can't avoid this, because, tech complicity in, the Israeli project very much does boil down to also projects of surveillance and military occupation. And so you do need to talk about those things as well. And so, I found myself, particularly when I was focusing on the resistance of tech workers via things like No Tech for Apartheid, that was one of the parts of the book where I was really able to tease out a lot of the other aspects, of tech complicity in apartheid and in genocide and in colonialism. And so looking at things like, how are these companies, really fortifying the surveillance of the military occupation? What do we know, what we've learned so far about the AI targeting programs, but how is there more to it than that? And on some level, not on some level, the thing about a book like this is it's very difficult to write and it's impossible to finish because all of these things keep changing. And so, I look now even at all of the revelations that are coming out about Palantir, and I'm thinking there's so much more that, if I'd known at the time, I think would have been valuable to say. But at the same time, what I was trying to do was to work in a manner that was very conscious of the fact that the things you're writing about are consciously changing. And so I tried to ask, what can you do in terms of analysis that hopefully can stay fresh, even as maybe the instruments you're describing are evolving, or the connections become even more blatant. But one thing I will say is that I think we're seeing a lot of not just an expansion of these processes and projects, but we're seeing the convergence even more. So even if we're thinking about things like ICE, if we're looking at the tools that ICE is using to surveil and track, right? Palantir is one of the main providers of those, but a lot of it also is very much modeled after the technology, that the occupation forces use to monitor Palestinians at checkpoints. So things like these programs that allow you to, scan people against the database, or that allow you to kind of, go through their media, through by using particular apps. All of that is really modeled after I believe the Red Wolf and the Blue Wolf programs that are used as part of monitoring Palestinians at checkpoints. So these things are also not just becoming refined in the Palestinian context; they're also being directly applied, to the occupation that we're seeing here in this moment as well.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk, and I'm excited to read the book. I have not yet read it, so I just want to name that. I'm curious about, I guess, a number of different things. So ideological warfare is definitely a war on ideas, and I think you're really speaking to this, and I'm really curious to hear how capital and funding is involved in this process on ideas, specifically because one thing that I'm interested in is not to just say that your interventions, which sound incredible and important, are not just a sole personal thought process in this theory industry that we're in, but rather that there is a call to action, if you will, that it seems that you're making here, again, on the war on ideas, and ideas that are consumed and circulated and produced in mainstream media, as you spoke about, are constantly capitalized upon, and we're complicit in consuming that. And so I'm curious, what is partially your call to action to do something different, to elaborate? I'm curious if you know what I mean with this. It's something that I've been interested in about, especially lately, as you said, because the project cannot finish given that there is so much changing constantly. And I think a part two of that question is, what's been the reception of your work in different contexts, given, again, this ideological warfare that we are a part of?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think in terms of capital and in terms of funding, I mean, there's obviously, I think the investments in these relationships and these projects of repression are only expanding, right? And in terms of, I mean, again, it's funny, like I always think, like, oh, I finished this, and then I see things that seem even more relevant to what I was thinking about, like just seeing, the millions of dollars that, Israel is putting into its Hasbara, propaganda program, the ways that Netanyahu is very consciously talking about, the importance of having online influencers be part of, Israeli propaganda, and just what happened with TikTok, which I started writing about in the book, but it wasn't at the point that it was when I finished the manuscript. I mean, now, basically, because of the messaging it's been, that it's been associated with related to Palestine, it's basically been sold to, Larry Ellison and Oracle, right? So that was a very direct example of how, if people use digital media in a particular way that, the powers that be do not like, they're going to just go ahead and directly intervene and shut it down. And so you had now, I mean, I think it's cartoonish to a level I wouldn't have necessarily expected. Like, not the fact that you have these collaborations, but the degree to which is, just this family is going to just have this cross media empire that is all going to be for Israel, right? I didn't expect that degree of blatancy. But so in terms of calls to action, there's several different aspects of resistance that I look at in the text that I really think it's important for people to continue to do. One of them, it's the most basic, but it's still very important, especially because we're in a moment where, the powers that are against us are so blatant that it feels like, there's no use to speaking out or speaking back. But it's very much important for people to continue to speak out and push back, to decry these collaborations that they're seeing, with these companies. And I think to kind of bring it home, one important local example of this is, are there companies, in our workplace, that are complicit in these processes, and can we initiate programs or, campaigns in our workplaces, basically, to get our companies to pull from this. Now, people have differing degrees of precarity and comfort, so you may not be able to do that, but that was one example. And even in terms of tech workers, I talked to a lot of tech workers who engaged in demonstrations and disruptions and spoke out. But then there were other people who didn't feel able to do that. But those people, acted as whistleblowers, which is still really important because actually all of what we know about tech, we really know in hindsight, right? We're finding out after the fact. So it's actually very important when people engage in whistleblowing because they're also doing something that's really important, which is informing us about things we never would have known about otherwise. Different types of activism and demonstrations. I mean, I finished this when, the encampments were still ongoing. And I think the repression that the encampments faced and the repression that it needs to be said universities very willingly and proudly engaged in, which is why sometimes I'm kind of torn between saying that, universities are capitulating to Trump. It's almost as though like there's a certain degree of collaboration because ultimately they don't want these encampments either. And they don't want, this activism and they don't want, focus on Palestine at all. So in fact, these are places that are acting in their best material interest on a certain level. And so I think just continuing to push back however we can and being creative with the forms that takes, but certainly there are several options that we have. And I do hope that, people will continue to do that in addition to thinking about this on a conceptual level.
I'm going to sound like a Zionist a little bit, and then you'll see that I'm not. Is apartheid an actual thing in Palestine? And the reason I ask that is if you look at apartheid in South Africa or in other places, that demographic that's being apartheid is usually used as cheap labor. It's a majority of the population. There's an attempt to keep them, right, and exploit them. In the case of Palestine, there's an attempt to use your term, erasure of Palestine, right? The slow destruction of Palestinian villages and bodies and through settlement policies. It doesn't look like the classic apartheid system. There is apartheid at the moment, but the actual objective is to have no apartheid with no Palestinians, or as very little number of Palestinians. And then when you look at digital settler colonialism, that erasure seems to be at a much faster pace for obvious reasons. It's a digital space that's controlled by those who own the platforms. And as we saw, that transformation, they've been trying to kind of also remove the Palestinian voice from those digital spaces. What should we call this kind of weird structure that doesn't have a name? Some people have actually recommended that we think of it as like Palestine's all of us now, or a big portion of the world as the structures around us are falling apart. AI is coming into being and new forms of a suppression where our labor is being removed, pretty much. That Israel becomes like the testing ground in that sense, right? It becomes a testing ground for a future system, maybe. I know it sounds conspiratorial, but I think there's something there. It's like maybe Palestine is a symbolic location of the possibility of the transformation of capitalism to something else. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have a hard time naming. It's not really apartheid. It is only at the moment apartheid that is slowly being erased. And maybe that is the world where a big part of us no longer do not live in states, but are completely distanced from other demographics and removed from any form of protection it's almost like abolition in a negative sense, abolition of the state in a very negative sense. And I just, when I always think about Palestine, I'm always thinking about that. Like, what's so different about Palestine that we have a hard time understanding that apartheid system? And I think it's that erasure and the fact that there's something evolving out of that might be relevant to the globe as a whole.
Yeah, That's a really great observation, and it really reminds me of what Shireen Saikali says. She has this phrase that she keeps coming back to, which is Gaza is not a lab, it's a paradigm. Palestine is not a lab, it's a paradigm, because it's not something that is removed and happens out there, right? It's also something that is kind of co-constitutive of all of our realities. And I think right now, actually, as you're saying, we're seeing even more directly the ways that the dissolution and the undoing and the elimination that we've seen in Gaza, that is not only spreading regionally, the logics of that, and I think a lot of the tech, I guess, that is facilitating that is also being turned against us directly. So a lot of these things are happening simultaneously. So I think it's right to say that we need to not see Palestine in isolation, but think about these things as kind of co-constitutive, actually. The point about apartheid, I agree. I think that there's been an acceleration, which is partly why I myself kind of, turned away from giving it sort of an analytical primacy, even though I think there is apartheid. And I think that, when we think about apartheid as an actionable category legally, right, it doesn't necessarily have to be a one-to-one relation, but it's more so, can you prove this process? But I do think now with, the ongoing accelerated genocide, everything else that's been happening, it does seem like there's something that has been really transcended. And so the old paradigms don't seem to really fit in the same way. And I think what we're seeing is part of a broader contemporary order that is being ushered in, that is impacting everybody, right? And so I think part of that order is precisely, the kind of the dissolution of a lot of the reference that we had, or the ways of providing some kind of a semblance of order, or of, collective rights. There was a piece a while ago, I forget who wrote it, but it's essentially titled, how Gaza broke the entire rules-based order, right? We're at a moment where, even if we were to argue that international law has always been kind of a facade to a certain extent, we don't even have the facade anymore. So what is going to happen now, right? What do we do with that? I think we're in this kind of like dangerous interregnum in this moment, and we really need to figure out how we're going to make our way out of it, right? And what is resistance going to look like? So I do think it's very bleak, but I actually think is going to sound perhaps a little bit, I don't know if this is going to come off as a little bit deranged to say, but I do think there is an upside to that. And the upside is that, really it's up to us to shape the world that we want to be a part of. And when we see that there's been this total abdication, by the institutions that have supposedly been entrusted, with all of our collective well-being, then it's really up to us to think about how do we together assume that responsibility, and how do we transform these spaces, right? And I'm not saying that facetiously. I really think that that's the task we're in when we're seeing this, the complete dissolution of everything. How are we going to make the difference? And how are we going to support and act in solidarity with others who are making the difference? I think that's the task at hand. No pressure.
So I was thinking about something that you shared towards the beginning about tech and it being patriarchal, anti-Black, misogynistic, all these things. And I guess something that I was curious about, because you started the book at such a specific time and then also had to publish it after October 7th and then also after the shift of a presidency in the United States, I was curious, in terms of, I don't know, there is a performance of liberalism and diversity and DEI that the United States was really rigorously promoting under Biden. And I know that part of your argument is that tech has always been racist and violent and colonial. But I was curious if you had any reflections or observations on the shifts in repression, and specifically in repression on social media. It sounds optimistic, but it's really just what are the possibilities that are opened up with a shift to this blatant fascism into Trump. Like, not to say that there are ways that Biden was less fascist, but I guess the I don't know, I guess the blatancy of this era, I was curious for you how it fits into the model around tech. And when you keep saying there are things I wish I would have written, I am curious about like this shift from liberalism and like imperial feminism and these things into this much more blatant white supremacist Christian Zionist government that we have right now. Like, how for you that shifts the narrative or ways that it opens up possibilities for repression in tech.
Yeah. I mean, this, particular moment, particularly with the second Trump administration, I think for all of the Silicon Valley companies, I think was really just kind of like a breath of fresh air, because they no longer had to pretend that they cared about, racism and misogyny and people's rights. And so they really leaned into this, right? Companies like Google, like, okay, we're not going to have these DEI policies anymore. They've stopped moderation around, anti-trans rhetoric, all of these things. And other scholars have really talked about this. I think Becca Lewis, talks about the origins of Silicon Valley has always been this kind of white male misogynistic sort of bro culture from the beginning. So really it's just like coming back to that. And I think the openings that come with, the fact that, these companies can really go mask off and do things like, give the Trump, like gold as a present, to whatever I think it does create new openings to really be able to get people to sort of leave these products, right? And you can actually, because part of the issue with the types of hegemony that we experience through big tech is that it becomes such a part of our lives that it's sort of impossible, and it can exercise this impunity precisely because of that, right? It's kind of what Cory Doctorow talks about with enshittification. Like, they just become so big, then they can do whatever they want. First they give you all this free stuff. They're really fun to use, and then all of a sudden they just become worse and worse because they realize that people can't go anywhere. But now, when it gets so blatant to a certain degree, people do have a limit for that too. And it starts to be, like, I don't necessarily need to continue to support this company that is, enabling ICE and is, part of a genocide and is also, really boosting all of this, right-wing fascist rhetoric. Like, what am I doing at this point, right? You start to kind of lose any kind of pressure that will keep you there, or most of it, right? And I think also, this is a moment in time where some of the broader allure that some of these companies and platforms had is sort of gone. Like, I think people understand now that there's a lot more than what is presented on some of these bigger platforms, and that, so because there's more of an understanding of how they work, then people can start to move away from them or deprioritize them in ways that maybe weren't even possible just 5 or 6 years ago. And I think that coincides well with the development of things like Tech for Palestine, where you have this hub that is literally developing alternative, uses of tech that are supposed to be decolonial, right? That are not anti-Palestinian, and that, people are migrating to more and more. So, there was that app Upscroll that had like a huge boost in people signing up for it, especially after, TikTok was given over to the Ellisons. So I think that there's actually openings for thinking about alternatives, and that some of that does come from just these places becoming so horrible that, people just reach their limit and say like, okay, well, I don't need to do this anymore. Right. So to me, that's one of the possibilities that is opened up, by these developments that are pretty terrible, but at the same time, I think have some unanticipated possibilities.
I have one more. I have one more question. I don't have one more. I have many, but I can just start with one. Also, in the beginning, you talked about wanting to spend time in these. You called them viral moments because they were the moments that went viral and did a specific thing. And I think the nature of a viral moment is that it is just that, it's a moment. And you mentioned Shadeen Sekli's, like, it's not it's a paradigm, right? Like, it's not, yeah, there's like a permanence to it in a way, or like it is, I'm going to drop that last part, but I'm thinking about that and lingering in what is supposed to be and what we are conditioned to experience as a quick, fleeting thing. with like, I think we talk about viral moments as like ruptures, and then it goes back to a status quo before. So where, I guess, like, how did you decide to stay in what is supposed to be like a fleeting moment?
For me, part of deciding to stay in that was trying to take what I think each of these forms of expression or these clips, like what were their ultimate implications, and just trying to sustain that ultimately. Because the idea isn't that, you have one meme that, kind of lands as humorous for people, and that humor kind of opens up a new understanding of the Palestinian context, and then that disappears, and then we have the genocide and everybody supports Israel, right? That's not what's supposed to happen. So part of it was, how do I try to sit as much as I can with what I think are the broader implications of these forms of expression, and also the potential that they're really opening up for all of us. What does it mean to do that? And for me, part of it was to actually think about what is behind these forms of expression and what can they really teach us about the way that the media industry works currently versus the way that it actually can be. Because that was one of the things that I kept coming back to, is there's always this tension between the possibility and the application. And I think what these companies really want is to limit it to their specific application, but there's so many more things that can be done, right? And I think it's really important for all of us to realize that possibility is there, because once you realize that, then that's something that you can't really be taken away. It doesn't matter what they say, in their, terms of service or whatever, like that's it. That this technology can do other things, and you're going to try to find a way to make it do that and to hold people accountable, for the fact that they're choosing not to let it be that way.
Hello. This is more kind of a reflection based on all of the things you have said about this profound work. Tech being used by organizers in different ways made me think a lot about what we have been living here in the Twin Cities, and how one example just quickly was that I was working with a collective of lawyers and interpreters and volunteers doing the habeas corpus petitions for folks in ICE detention, and we ran into this problem where on our Google spreadsheet, like Google wasn't used to having so many people, like hundreds of volunteers accessing the spreadsheet simultaneously, because every night or every day we're like working on it. And we also had the challenge of like, we don't want to keep all this data about people's lives and privacy and loved ones, and and we put as little as we could about people's individual situations obviously into the spreadsheet, but sort of that idea of like, when you're in struggle and you're using these tools, you start realizing that like there are limitations, and it's only in that moment of struggle that you really start realizing we need to change this situation. And I know I wasn't deeply involved because I'm not a tech person, and I think maybe there's a few here who can speak to it, but I know there was a lot of really cool things that happened here in the Twin Cities around. I know we had like a scanner of the like the license plates immediately to know and about which ones were already registered as like ICE plates, and so there was a lot of quick, amazing, like creative things that were happening that were gave me a lot of hope in the face of sort of the insurmountable odds. And it made me think that there must be so many ways that folks in Palestine are doing the same thing that like we can't even imagine, because it's only when you're confronting that moment, or maybe we can't imagine, and scholars are researching and writing about it and connected to folks on the ground who are creating those tools. But it made me feel like, how can there, with the spreadsheet thing, I was like, how is there not an alternative already to this that people know about, that we can use, where hundreds of us can be on this like collective spreadsheet with hundreds of people's names who we're trying to get out of detention. So just thank you for your work, and sort of being able to make those connections locally feels really powerful and hopeful in a certain sense.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, and for honestly giving us a really important local example, because that is also something that I was trying to think through. I mean, it's not only just about Palestine or the Palestinian context. It is about like, how does tech work in relationship to oppression more broadly, and then what are the potentials for innovation that we experience through struggle, exactly. And then realizing like how problematic the actual conventions of a lot of these platforms that just became the default are for all of us, So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was curious if there's anyone else here who experienced those things locally and other like in tech interventions.
No, I was curious actually if I didn't get through the entirety of your book, so, but the 2022, I think, I don't know if it was Uday Tamimi, I don't remember, but the guy who is allegedly responsible for the killing of an IOF soldier and then had a bald head, so the algorithms and the surveillance technologies were like, that's how the IOF was going through towns, was they were trying to find him. So then everyone in solidarity shaved their heads in all the different villages around the area, so that it was really difficult for them to use technology to accurately identify. So it's not local, I guess, but I think just it's something that I was thinking about in like relation to like these types of like subversions that happen, and like I don't know, it's just really. And then now with like ICE detentions and with the technology that ICE is using, there is leeway now in the fine print of I can't remember what this app that ICE is using. It's like something really basic, like Face Watch or something, but ICE officers are using it as a phone, where it's a phone that it scans a person's image, and then the image is itself a database that will tell ICE if this person is a citizen or not. But the leeway that ICE has now been given is there is high probability that the information that's scanned is inaccurate and that the image is inaccurate, and whether or not the information in the registrar as to whether or not this person is a citizen is accurate is also not guaranteed. But even then, if ICE arrests the person, then the arrest is still legitimate. And it reminds me actually a lot of like the back and forth of like I don't know, like ways that people subvert things, of like trying to come through, and then the ways that the like government will try to come back and like, to me that's like a weird call and response of like thousands of people shaved their head to try to combat this thing that was trying to recognize them. So then the government's new rule is everyone, whether if you're vaguely recognized by the system, you are now someone who is acceptable to be arrested, and like having to try to find ways to combat people's popular resistance and their things. So I don't know, I just feel like it's like an ongoing synthesis of like ways to try to respond. But yeah.
I guess, yeah, maybe one other thing on that note, actually, not something that I had written about, but one of the recent developments around this, like even in terms of like people using technology or crowdsourcing particular resources, is, there's been increasing government pressure against sites that are giving information about, ICE officers, basically, like, who are they? How do we identify them, right? And, there's been increasing pressure by the government basically sending out these threatening letters to cite people that use things like Facebook to just post this information, basically, right? Threatening them to take it down. And so, to me, that's another interesting example, because it's people who are using technology in this very concrete way that is a need right now, where it's like we have all these, masked, agents basically that are going around kidnapping, assaulting, and terrorizing. So how do we find out who they are, and how do we protect ourselves, and how do we even know where they're operating? Because some of these things had even just been like, where are they currently, so we know to avoid, right? And then you'll have the government coming in and just trying to like get people to take it down. And so you have this censorship by proxy, because then the companies are saying, well, we don't want to deal with this, so we're going to take it down, right? So that's another way that we're seeing that these companies will engage in particular forms of suppression, basically, even if it's not quote unquote illegal, even if it's not something that is actually harmful content, and it's actually something that is helping people, and so again, that is the call and response. So then it's, how do you find new creative ways to basically continue to get this information to people, but realizing that, you know, these channels and these platforms are definitely not going to be acting in your best interest, but in their own self-interest.
Are there any? Oh, I just needed to. We're here. Are there any other questions? Was my question. Ari, do you have a question?
Thoughts are good.
I give you a free ride. That means you have to ask a question.
Fine.
I'm not going to charge them.
Well, I didn't pay for it, so it was free, technically. Well, now I have to exchange my intellectual labor for the ride. By think about that. Thank you for the talk. I mean, right now I'm really thinking about the relationship between, like, an agent, like a tech worker, who is responding to, like, you know, something like their company supporting the genocide and the, you know, surveillance industry that's, you know, part of all this. And I'm wondering, like, how narrative and how narrative can maybe unite the actions that are happening within these tech workers with maybe other people who are on the supply chain of their company, who are maybe more towards the industrial working class, like, or people who are making the chips or transporting things. Or, I mean, obviously it's really hard because the labor is so separated from each other, even if you're working within, you know, a same supply chain. I'm curious if you've done any thinking about how the struggles to fight against Israel and the involvement of these companies can be united across the actions that are happening within these more service jobs or tech jobs with the other people in the supply chain of these companies.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I was really struck by when I was doing work, particularly on the No Tech for Apartheid chapter, was how much work that the tech workers themselves had been doing in terms of, I guess, reconsidering their broader position, because a lot of them had to come to this understanding of the fact that being a kind of what people think of when they think of a tech worker, like that particular, like, you know, say software engineer or something like that, where they realize that there's a lot of intentional distancing that is placed between them and other workers in the company. And so they realize that what we need to do is we need to unpack a lot of those layers of distancing where we're encouraged to think of ourselves as, you know, separate or unique or special, and also to be given certain privileges that are based upon us not making those connections. And so, you know, one of the people I actually talked to was an organizer named Zelda Montes, who very much identified actually as a narrative organizer and somebody who works through narrative and storytelling. And they said that, you know, precisely that tech labor introduces all of these exceptions to make people forget the fact that this is, at the end of the day, really a question of labor and labor exploitation. And then so you have the possibility of labor resistance. So all that's to say that I think that there are definitely a lot of possibilities, and I think people who are inside and people who, you know, are have been fired and are on the outside but are still very much working for the cause are a lot more aware of that and working on those possibilities now and thinking about, what does cross-sector collaboration and labor solidarity look like. So I definitely think it's something that people are aware of and are working towards, and it's really important to note. Because that was something that really struck me, was how conscious of the fact these folks had to become like, oh wow, like there's all of these other people who are even more exploited, and I'm supposed to see myself as being separate from that. So even as they were working on Palestine, part of working on Palestine was also coming to that confrontation. Like they were not separate processes. I don't have a favorite chapter, but I definitely think that chapter 8, which is the narrative shifts in digital muzzling one, was really important to do, because that's the chapter where I really talk about the history of the development of the internet in Palestine, and how Palestinian digital resistance really starts in the aftermath of the Second Intifada. And just understanding how much, of the Palestinian experiences on the internet are really shaped and in many ways limited by the Oslo Accords, because I'd always only thought of the Oslo Accords or the peace process really in terms of the ways that, it was the abdication of armed resistance, to engage in the state building process, and Palestinians, essentially certain factions of the leadership, I should say, very engaged in the state building process, gave up, armed struggle before really securing any gains. And then, of course, it was a continued process of continuing to just take away more and more Palestinians' rights. But I didn't realize that the internet itself in Palestine is an outgrowth of that as well, because the ICT sector was also something that was really mapped out within the Oslo process. So you actually had a lot of people who were in the diaspora who came back to Palestine to develop the ICT sector, working through what would essentially become the PA. And so the internet that you end up with is, of course, ultimately an Israeli internet, because Palestinians don't have digital autonomy, as they don't have political or land-based autonomy in other senses. So that was really interesting to grapple with, because in many ways I think it encapsulated the broader contradictions of digital resistance, which is that there are all these limitations, there is all this suppression, there's these moments of opening and possibilities, but you're working within this broadly oppressive structure. So what do you do with that? So I didn't realize how much that mapped out, even in terms of the history of the political infrastructure of the ICT too. But also just reckoning with the fact that media resistance is something that Palestinians had always been engaging in, I think was really important as well.
What about kind of connecting to the similar kind of material basis for how the internet exists within Palestine is, what about payment infrastructure and the way that so much of our electronic cash transfers are also mediated through these platforms that are in that same control? Have you encountered any other sort of alternatives, or have you explored that concept in any way? It's something that I've seen a lot of GoFundMes being shared across, and those things that raise a lot of issues.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think I don't remember if it's in the introduction or in the preface, but I have a section where I'm very upfront about the fact that the framework that I've been thinking through is something that can be captured by many other instances of online suppression and repression. And so I talk about, for example, like Airbnb, renting out, homes and settlements, and colonies, basically. I was like, that's an example of digital settler colonialism. The fact that PayPal, right, blocks Palestinians, and the fact that you have GoFundMes and that oftentimes, don't give the money, or basically just, just shut down the fundraisers. All of those things are also examples of that. It's not something that I really teased out in the text because I was focused in this iteration of the project really on narrative more broadly, but it's definitely something that I think is important to think about in relationship to digital colonialism, because it's in many ways it's actually the starkest reflection of that, because this is literally like money. This is funds for people to be able to get food, to have the most basic necessities met in a moment of genocide. So yeah, definitely I think it's something that we need to have continued and more attention on. And it's also, one of the groups that I talked to, the Good Shepherd Collective, I think was very attentive to just thinking about that. They even brought home the fact of, we have a lot of organizing that has started since the genocide, but there isn't enough attention on the need to actually contribute funds to people during this moment, right? So we need a lot more sharing of GoFundMes and things like that. So I just think that that's important to keep coming back to, is everything also has to begin and end, with supporting these fundraisers and supporting alternatives, to finding this digital infrastructure that will actually accommodate Palestinians.
Do we want to give some time for folks to go downstairs before 8 o'clock?
Yeah, if no one else has any questions, we don't have to all go together, but I
There's a lot of food
to eat food, and also to go downstairs and check out the exhibition, essentially, that is it's a Visualizing Palestine exhibition about the erasure and about the importance of narrative, and about the importance of narrative erasure in the digital, and material world. It's very actually related. So, yeah, I invite you guys to go downstairs and check it out. And also, do you want to say the hours that the ESFL will be open for it after tonight too?
Yeah, it's kind of a confusing amount of hours. So we'll post it on our social media and our website tomorrow, because it's a few Saturdays, and then during our regular open hours that are Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, but that's from 10 to 3. So a lot of folks that, are at work can't make it during our open hours. So we plan to have some Saturdays in the next few weeks, but we'll post about them tomorrow.
Well, thank you, Omar, for coming and for talking and answering everyone's wonderful questions.
Thank you. Go.
Thank you, Omar. Thanks, Layla.